I am. He's a recently released the novel Light which impresses. She earned a PhD in English and American Literature from the University of North Texas. No other than Miss Dorothy P. Ward.
Hi, Daniel. Thank you for having me. I'm really pleased to be here and ready to talk about the book and other things.
Welcome, Miss Dorothy on Book 101 Review. And can you please introduce more about yourself that I missed?
Absolutely. As you indicated, I got my PhD from the University of North Texas, and I worked at the University of Texas at El Paso for over 35 years as a faculty member and an administrator. I also earned my bachelor's and my master's degree in English with a creative writing option from the University of Texas at El Paso, known as UTEP. And so, with the 35 years of working there and all the years of going to school at institutions in Texas, you'd think I was a dyed-in-the-wool Texan. But the reality is that my father was a career Army officer, and so I was born into a military family. And as a result, we traveled quite a bit. I was actually born in Heidelberg, Germany, and within the first 12 years of my schooling, I went to 8 different schools. But my father was in air defense, and at that time, Fort Bliss was a major air defense center, and Fort Bliss is headquartered in El Paso, Texas. So he kept returning, he kept being stationed at Fort Bliss. And so I learned to think about El Paso and the El Paso region as sort of my hometown or home region. Having said that, I don't actually live in Texas. I live just on the outskirts of El Paso, and that's in New Mexico, the state of New Mexico. I live there with 2 unruly German shepherds, a blue-eyed horse, and a rescue donkey. And I like to say that I live across the street from Texas, which is just about the case. But I learned to really love the El Paso region. I learned to love the beauty and serenity of the desert and the mountains. I learned to love the blend of cultures in El Paso. El Paso is a city with about a population of about 700,000, and about 81% are Hispanic or Latinx. And so there's a wonderful blend of culture and of history that I love. And I'm also fascinated by the history of the region.
And Miss Dorothy, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world. Here on Book 101 Review, we celebrate you with my cheering squad. Thank you. So today, let's talk about the light which impresses us. You first encountered the idea of a woman warrior in Pancho Villa's armies in 1983. Your novel was released decades later, is that correct?
Oh, that's correct. It wasn't released until July 2025, quite a while later.
So, what kept the seeds alive in you across so many years and life changes?
Well, in 1983, a local newspaper published an article, an interview with an elderly woman who lived in Ciudad Juarez. And she said she was a colonel in Pancho Villa's army. At that time, I didn't know a lot about the Mexican Revolution, and I certainly didn't know the role that women inhabited in the Mexican Revolution. And so it was an interesting story to me. And I actually my father was a history buff as well and a photographer. And we got the address of this woman who was a colonel in Pancho Villa's army and went with 2 friends to Juarez to interview her and to meet her. When we got there, we learned that she had recently moved, and her neighbors were reluctant, understandably so, to give us her new address. And so I never had an opportunity to meet her, but it sparked an interest. And I started reading about the Mexican Revolution and learned that women inhabited many roles in the Mexican Revolution, including the role of a soldadera. Soldaderas were women who traveled with the troops, sometimes preceding them, but they would establish the camps. They would forage for supplies. They would cook the food. They would help care for the wounded. And they would also fight in the battles. And so that information fascinated me. At the time, however, I was working on my PhD and I still had doctoral comps to study for and then a dissertation to research and write. And so I was fascinated by the revolution, but I set it aside for quite a few years. And it wasn't until I finished my PhD that I started really researching in depth the Mexican Revolution and the role of women warriors in the Mexican Revolution. And so I started writing the book probably in the late 90s. And I had about 120 pages, but I had to put the book aside because I was given a new administrative position that was very, very demanding and required a lot of time and a lot of energy. So I set aside the book and didn't come back to it, though I didn't forget about it. I didn't come back to it until I retired. Well, as it turns out, the hiatus from the book actually was probably very, very beneficial because I had been writing the book initially from the perspective of from Cata, the character Cata or Catalina, who was a soldadera. And I came to a realization that I couldn't really write the book honestly from the perspective of a Mexican woman fighting for her country. And so I changed the focus of the novel, and the protagonist that I developed was Sarah Delaney, who was a woman who lived in El Paso and was impacted by the Mexican Revolution and all that was going on in the Mexican Revolution. But developed as a photographer, so she became the main character. And so that's what kept me going. What fascinated me, I have to say, about the revolution is not only the impact it had on people on the border region, but also how many of the issues that arose during the revolution along the border are issues that are in the forefront of our news today. The relationship, the political relationship between the United States and Mexico, smuggling and sedition, immigration, internment, and deportation, racism, racial profiling, and race charged riots. And so it was interesting to me that this was part of the revolution, but it's also these are issues we face today in our world.
Well said, Miss Dorothy. You set the manuscript aside for nearly 10 years when you assume an administrative position. When you return to it, what had shifted inside you, and how did the shift change the novel?
Well, as I mentioned, I came to a realization that I couldn't write from the perspective of a Mexican woman. It just wasn't going to be believable. Now, that's not to say that Catalina isn't still a major character in this story, and she does have part of the story to tell, but the majority of it was from the perspective of the photographer who lived in El Paso. So El Paso, I was very familiar with, and so it wasn't a stretch to write from that perspective. And I think as a result, the book became better and more realistic, more believable, more honest.
Believable and honest. You made the difficult decision to shift the protagonist from Mexican soldadera to American female photographer. What did it mean to you write honesty?
Well, it was important for the novel to be believable, for somebody to pick it up and read it and believe the characters. and feel as though they were individuals that they knew. And so that notion of being honest in the writing of the character, I think, was in order to make sure that the characters were believable. And I think that was achieved.
Achieve. Your protagonist, Sarah, is a female photographer navigating the border during the Mexican Revolution. What drew your photography as her lens into the world, literally and metaphorically?
What drew her lens into the world is it uh,
Yes, please.
she she is in a relationship with an American who is fighting in the Mexican Revolution. In fact, there was a group of foreigners who essentially formed a foreign legion that were led by Garibaldi during the Mexican Revolution. And so she's in a relationship with him. And on her 19th birthday, he gives her a camera, and as a result of receiving the camera, she starts taking pictures. He takes her over to the camp, over into Juarez, into the camp, and she takes some photographs that when she has them developed, the person who owns the photographer who owns the shop wants to purchase those negatives and start making picture postcards, which were very popular at that time, and sell them. So that got her involved. Her relationship with her lover at that time, and then her interaction and introduction to another photographer developed her as a photographer. And so she used her lens to take pictures of what was happening in El Paso and what was happening in Ciudad Juarez and then the surrounding area as well.
Your novel is set between 1910 and 1916, isn't it, Miss Dorothy? Yet you note that its themes, border tensions, migration, racial profiling, sedition, are still today's headlines. What does fiction allow us to understand about these issues that journalism and history cannot?
Well, I think the thing about history, and especially historical fiction, is it allows us to learn about a period in history and about the impact that individuals experienced as a result of that period and what was going on. But we're able, and even though there are issues that are relevant today, we're able to see them objectively because we're looking at them from a distance. So I think the literature is very valuable. Historical fiction is very valuable because it allows us to learn about a period, but it allows us to gain some objective or objectivity in terms of understanding events that are taking place.
Miss Dorothy, you spent more than 30 years at UTEP on the border. How did living and working in a specific geography shape your understanding of the historical events you were writing about?
Well, having lived and worked on the border, I'm familiar with the city, and I learned to become familiar with the Mexican Revolution. I'm fascinated by the culture of the city, the blend of cultures and the friendliness. And so that sort of experience and the experience of the people with whom I interact at work and who are my friends also taught me a lot and prepared me for the development of the novel. Daniel, you mentioned the novel being set in 1910. Mexican Revolution was between 1910 and 1920, but you're right. The novel itself is set between the 1910 1916, the earlier years. But it's also set in 1983. It's told in a way that it moves between two time periods, and the reason for that is I wanted to capture what was happening in the Mexican Revolution, and use it as a backdrop for what was happening to individuals who were living in the El Paso Ciudad Juarez region. But I also wanted to bring it up to the 1983, and I'll talk more about that in just a second. But I want to explain a little bit for individuals who may not be familiar with the El Paso region, that, as I've already mentioned, El Paso, Texas is on the westernmost tip of Texas. And so it's on the border with New Mexico, but it's also on the border of the international border of Mexico. And we're just divided by a very narrow, shallow river, the Rio Grande. And so there's a real shared history there. And people cross over the border fairly freely for entertainment or to visit family or for educational purposes. Um, and so that notion of the fluidity of the border was of interest. And so what was happening in Mexico was impacting El Paso during the Mexican Revolution. I mentioned that the novel is set during two time periods. In 1983, the main character, the protagonist, Sarah Delaney, is 91 years old, and she is known as a bit of a recluse. She's famed for her photographs of the Mexican Revolution, but she's known as a bit of a recluse. She doesn't go to exhibits of her photographs. She doesn't do interviews. She doesn't go to museums that have her photographs. And it's even sort of rumored in the city that, maybe she's not alive anymore, or maybe she's not well. And suddenly in 1983, she reaches out to two professors who at the Institute for Oral History at the University of Texas at El Paso, and she invites them into her home to start interviewing her. And she tells them, "You and I both have something to gain from reopening the past." And so Sarah Delaney was witness to battles and executions, to smuggling and sedition, to internment, deportation, to profiling and racial rioting. And so while she has the individuals there with her, she's being interviewed and she tells her life and those experiences. She also interacts with a number of historical characters, including Pancho Villa, General Pancho Villa, and General John J. Pershing, Blackjack Pershing. And so these individuals, along with other characters, are woven into the fabric of her memories. And she relates these memories in the interviews. And she says essentially that she's doing these interviews because she's hoping to rewrite the conclusion of her life. The novel is told in 5 parts. Each part is framed by the interview. So each part, the beginning and the end, is set in 1983. And then the middle portion is the memory of what took place during the Mexican Revolution.
Well said, Miss Dorothy. Interesting indeed. So, what is the most common misconception people who do not live in the border have about the US Mexico border, and how does your novel quietly correct it?
Well, I think the misperception about the Mexican border is that it's a tremendously violent area and that there's tension that exists between Mexicans and those who reside in the United States. Actually, El Paso in this region is a very, very safe region, tremendous interaction among people. El Pasoans are very caring people. I think that comes across in the novel as well, that there are relationships that are developed in the novel, that there is not the sort of with the main characters, there isn't the sort of racism that you see in some instances in the novel. It does address that, but that's a misperception about the border, the violence and the strife that exists. That simply isn't true. At least not in the El Paso region.
Well said, Miss Dorothy. What do you hope readers take away from Light Which Impresses that they won't find in any other novel about the border or the Mexican Revolution?
Well, just from the book itself, I hope they take away just an enjoyment. I hope they look forward to reading it, and I hope they have trouble putting it down and going to sleep at night because they want to keep reading. So I hope they find it of great interest, and will continue reading. You know, I don't know quite how to say that it differs. I mean, there are certainly novels about the Mexican Revolution and novels that are written very well, but I think perhaps in Light Which Impresses, the two strong female characters are what will draw you to Light Which Impresses. There are women, the photographer, Sarah Delaney, and the soldadera, Kata, are two individuals who experience love and joy and loss and sorrow. And they're two individuals who find each other and develop a relationship. And they're two individuals who live and love fiercely and passionately and are unwilling to kowtow to social norms. I mean, they're two unconventional characters, a soldadera and a photographer in the 19 teens. So I think those characters are characters that will draw readers into the book. I think also the interview approach, so that the story is moving with the interviews from the macro of looking at the larger issues that were happening during the revolution, to the micro where you're reading about how the revolution impacted and affected individuals, will make the reading interesting. The book moves in a way, I think of the author William Faulkner's statement. He wrote that the past is never dead. It's not even the past, meaning, what happened in the past continues to impact and affect our lives. And I think that is an important point that's made in the novel, with the movement between the 19 teens and the 1983, and Sarah wanting to benefit from the interviews. Remember, she says, we're both going to gain something from reopening the past, and her desire to rewrite the conclusion of her life. So I think those are things that will attract people and bring them to the novel. And I hope enjoy the novel thoroughly.
We hope, Miss Dorothy, that people like it. And before we wrap up our discussion for today, I'm inviting you to please do listen to my other podcast, people. My other podcast, because my abstract essay is already in sixth season, abstract poetry and third season, and of course my book 101 review in sixth season too, comedy 101 fourth season, and my food 101 in sixth season as well, geography 101 love letters, movie 101 review, music 101 fifth season, science 101, sex 101. It's third season, trivia 101, motivation 101, spiritual awakening 101, entrepreneurship 101, law 101, mental health 101, coaching 101, and of course my Bible verses 101 are my baby podcasts. Please listen to them wherever you listen your podcasts. So Miss Dorothy, my last question is, you began this story with a newspaper clipping about an elderly woman who claimed to have been colonel in Pancho Villa's army. If you could meet the woman today, what would you want to tell her about the novel she helped inspire?
I would relate the story to her, and I would explain to her the impact she had on my life. I mean, as you've pointed out, that's 30 years of thinking and reading about the book, and her life inspired a lot of time on my part investigating the book. So that's what I would tell her.
Well, beautifully articulated, Miss Dorothy. So can you please invite our listeners to support Light Which Impresses?
Yes, please do. It can be purchased as an ebook or a hard copy, and it can be purchased at any bookseller online, Amazon, or TCU Press.
Yes, people, let's support Miss Dorothy Ward, because if you support her, for sure, more and more light which impresses will rise. So, Miss Dorothy, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Daniel.
You're most welcome, and I will invite you again to be part of my abstract essay, and let's talk about, well, light which impress us. Let's continue our conversation over there. So, thank you again. Monica people, see you soon.